burning in Iran this morning after a massive blast rocked the country's main port over the weekend. At least 46 people were killed and over 1,000 were injured in the explosion at the Bandar Abbas port in southern Iran. The big question now is what caused the carnage? Here's a pretty good indicator from the AP. The port received missile fuel chemical in March. It was part of a shipment of ammonium perchlorate from China by two vessels to Iran. The chemical used to make solid propellant for rockets was going to be used to replenish Iran's missile stocks, which had been depleted by its direct attacks on Israel during the war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Iranian military officials denied receiving the chemical shipments from China, of course. But the size and scale of the explosion on Saturday, folks, it was felt and heard 30 miles away, reminded many of the massive blast in Beirut port back in 2020, which was caused by the ignition of thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate chemicals. Now, the timing of the Iran blast is obviously very interesting. It came on the same day that U.S. and Iranian officials were holding a third round of talks over Iran's nuclear program. That's led some to blame Israel, although Israel has denied any involvement. Regardless of the source, the devastating blast at Bandar Abbas port shows a few things very clearly. Number one, the Iranian regime is quite literally playing with fire. They're trying to rebuild their ballistic missile program, and yes, they want to develop nuclear weapons. Number two, they're getting significant help on both of those fronts from China and Russia. Folks, I've called the alliance between Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea the Gathering Storm Coalition, and it is clearly on the move. Just last week, Russia announced that it's going to help Iran build a new nuclear plant. That can't be good. As for China, it's not only shipping Iran missile fuel, as you heard a minute ago. According to Iran's foreign minister, the two American adversaries are in the midst of a, quote, golden year of relations. Also not good for America, Israel, and the free world. Speaking of the communist regime in Beijing, here's the good news. President Trump is meeting the challenge head on. Coming up, we'll break down the U.S.-China trade war with two top China experts, and you'll learn what China's communist regime is doing here in your backyard. Now. He's author of the explosive #1 bestseller, Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Peter Schweitzer is a renowned investigative journalist and president of the Government Accountability Institute. His work has exposed corruption at the highest levels of power, from Washington to Wall Street, and his latest revelations are some of the most shocking yet. Tonight, Peter joins us to break down China's covert war on America, from flooding our streets with fentanyl, to infiltrating our political elite, to using multinational corporations as pawns in a global game of dominance. He's also host of the great podcast, Drill Down. Peter, great to see you as always. And I think a good place, or a bad place to start, would be fentanyl and China's role in flooding America's streets with this deadly drug. We've seen tens of thousands of Americans killed from fentanyl. Peter, how intentional is China's flooding of America with this drug? Is this part of that larger covert war that they're waging?
Yeah, China calls it disintegration warfare, and it's a war that stops short of an actual kinetic fighting war, but it's intended to damage your opponent, to kill your opponent, weaken them, etc. And when it comes to fentanyl, it is, in fact, chemical warfare. I think the biggest myth about fentanyl is people view it as sort of a latest rendition of what the Mexican drug cartels are doing. The Mexican drug cartels are the junior partners. China produces the precursor chemicals that create fentanyl. Those are imported in the port of Manzanillo in Mexico. That port is run by a Chinese state-owned company. Those precursors are then shipped to northern Mexico, where the drug cartels turn them into fentanyl. But who turns them into fentanyl for the drug cartels? 2,000 Chinese nationals, as we know, according to the DEA. The pill presses that they use to turn the fentanyl into the pills. Remember, the people that are dying of overdoses of fentanyl don't know they're taking fentanyl. They think they're taking a Vicodin or an Adderall. You need big pill presses to produce those. Those pill presses are produced from China, and China sells them to the Mexican drug cartels at cost, which means they're not turning a profit. And then the final component or link in the chain is the money laundering. You're a drug cartel. You've made all this money selling this poison in the United States. You need to launder your money. Back in the old days of Pablo Escobar and cocaine, you used Latin American banks to launder your money. The Mexican drug cartels, the Sinaloa drug cartel, for example, they use Chinese state-owned banks to launder their money. So this is a Chinese operation even more than it is a Mexican drug cartel operation.
Yeah, Peter, it's nefarious, it's insane. And you also talk about in your incredible book, Blood Money, China's involvement in the illegal gun trade. But I want to talk also about what you call in the book elite capture. The Chinese communist regime essentially getting a hold of influential U.S. political figures by offering their family members money and gigs and influence. Tell us more about that, because that is completely disturbing, and the American people need to know about it.
Yeah, it's called elite capture, you're right? That's the Chinese term. And what they say they're looking for in elite capture is big help with a little bad mouth. And what that means is they understand that an American politician that they have sort of captured in this technique is going to have to criticize China from time to time. What they want help is on the big stuff, which is access to our technology, to our capital markets, and to our commercial market in order to sell their goods in an unrestricted way. And it cuts on both sides of the political aisle. I'll pick one of each. Joe Biden, former president of the United States, his family received some $31 million from Chinese businessmen that were linked to the CCP, linked to Chinese intelligence. There's no discernible, legitimate function or service that his family performed for that money. It was a prime example of elite capture. Look at the Republican side of the aisle. You have a guy like Mitch McConnell, who is the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. He married into the Chow family, his wife Elaine Chow. That family owns a shipping business, and the Chinese government basically builds their ships, finances the construction of their ships, provides crews for their ships, and provides contracts through Chinese state-owned companies. So it's to the point where if Mitch McConnell were to do something to offend the Chinese government could destroy the family shipping business overnight. That's the kind of leverage they want. So elite capture is a way of bypassing having to compete against the United States. You basically just buy off elements of their elite so you get the policies that you want.
Peter, this is absolutely chilling. Joe Biden was the president of the United States. Mitch McConnell, as you said, Senate Majority Leader, and the Chinese are exerting influence with them. And you lay it all out, Blood Money. Hey, you mentioned shipping, and I think of the Panama Canal. Of course, President Trump has put the Panama Canal front and center and kind of weaning that Chinese influence out of the canal. How central is control of the Panama Canal to the Chinese communist regime and their overall goals and ideology?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, they are looking for a number of things. They're looking for economic and technological dominance. They're also looking for geographical dominance. And with the Panama Canal, they essentially have that. That same company, Hutchison, that owns the port where all the fentanyl is pouring into Mexico, is the same company that owns both ends of the Panama Canal, manages that critical waterway. And I think what people don't appreciate, they look at what Donald Trump is doing. They think it's sort of detached and helter-skelter. There's actually, I think, a very important grand strategy behind it, which is to counter China. So you look at the Panama Canal. Why does he want ownership of the canal back or control reverted back to the United States? Because of the threat presented from China. Look at the issue of tariffs. Yes, there are tariffs set up on all sorts of countries, but the way that Trump is constructing it, he is essentially trying to turn the rest of the world against China to isolate them when it comes to international trade. Or if you look at the Ukraine-Russia war that is occurring, whatever one thinks about what the terms of that agreement should be, what Trump is clearly trying to do is further isolate China, the argument being that Russia has essentially been pushed into the hands of China because they've been isolated because of their aggression over Ukraine. So I think if you look back at a lot of the things that Trump is doing, it is rooted in this notion that we have to meet the China challenge, we have to beat it back, and make sure that American interests are protected.
Peter, well said. Great points all around, folks. Be sure to follow Peter on X, across social media, and pick up the #1 bestseller, Blood Money, Amazon.com, wherever books are sold. Peter, great to see you. Keep up the great work, my friend. God bless. We'll see you again soon. And coming up after the break, more on Chinese communist infiltration of the United States. What are the Chi-Coms doing on our military bases? Our good friend Gordon Chang joins us to break that down, and it will shock you. That's next. Welcome back to Stack a Bit tonight. The stakes could not be higher. As President Trump slams China with a tariff hike, the message is clear. The days of economic appeasement are over. This isn't just a trade dispute. It's a full-scale economic counteroffensive against a communist regime that's been bleeding America dry. To help us unpack what's really at play here and what's coming next, we're joined by a leading authority on the China threat, our good friend Gordon Chang, Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow and author of the great book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Gordon, always great to see you. Hey, let's start with a story that I think is going to shock a lot of our viewers. GNC, General Nutrition Centers, very well-known health and supplement company throughout the United States, was acquired in 2020 by a Chinese company that has links to the Chinese communist regime. Now, Congressman Pat Harrigan of North Carolina just introduced a bill, Gordon, saying, look, no more of this. We can't have GNCs operating on American military bases. GNC stores right now, Gordon, are seen at over 80 U.S. military installations. That's hard to believe. Tell us more about that and why it's so dangerous.
It's so dangerous because China is hoovering up all this information about members of our military and their families. And they could use that for various purposes. Clearly, this is just outrageous. But what concerns me more is not so much the Chinese wanting this information. I can certainly understand that. What I can't understand, Eric, is why our military would permit this in the first place. This is just a failure of target recognition. And I think that it speaks to a problem inside the Pentagon, which is not just at the lower levels, but at the very top. And I hope that the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, starts to deal with this, because we cannot have Communist Party units on our military bases, because that's what this is.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Pete Hegseth, look, he's got a tall order correcting the mistakes of the previous administration, of course, but this has to be top of the list. Over 80 GNC stores at military installations across the United States. It's astounding, Gordon. Hey, but that's a tip of the iceberg, right? With Chinese infiltration in the United States. Of course, you and I have talked about the communist regime flooding the streets of America with fentanyl. What are some of the other levers the Chinese communist regime is using here in America in terms of infiltration? For instance, buying up land, large acres of land in America. The list goes on, right?
Yeah, the infiltration is across the board. So, for instance, we have secret police stations. The FBI closed one, but according to Daily Caller and New York Post reporting, there's 7 to 9 more in the United States. We have these Confucius Institutes in our college and university campuses. And although the number has been substantially reduced, these Confucius Institutes have opened up on another guise of new names. Also, Confucius classrooms in secondary schools. We found that secret Chinese biological weapons lab in Reedley, California, which had 20 pathogens at least, and almost 1,000 mice that have been genetically engineered to spread disease. We know the Chinese have been infiltrating political parties, both of them. The list goes on. They have gotten at every institution in our country. So this is across the board, Eric.
Yeah, and Gordon, you've been sounding the alarm about this for years. China has done this unabated, but now along comes President Trump, and he says enough is enough. And number one is correcting the trade, shall we say, imbalance with the communist regime in Beijing. He's levying 145% tariffs on Chinese goods. Gordon, there's a lot of wailing in the mainstream media and on the left in particular, but why are these tariffs against China a smart thing for President Trump to be putting forward?
We need to revitalize American manufacturing. And to do that, we need tariff barriers. That's not the entire story. We also, of course, need incentives like tax credits, tax breaks for Americans to start and to grow businesses. But it's very hard to do that without the tariff barriers. And also, we just need to start imposing some costs on China for predatory and criminal trade practices. So, for instance, in 2018, when President Trump imposed his 25% tariffs on China, this was a remedy for the theft of U.S. intellectual property. And the theft of U.S. IP has only gotten worse since then. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year, Eric, perhaps as much as $500 billion a year, as John Ratcliffe, when he was ending his term as the Director of National Intelligence, wrote in the Wall Street Journal. So really, this is something that we have got to get at. We're on the edge of some catastrophic developments, it appears. And so we have to prepare ourselves. And that means we shouldn't be thinking peacetime. We should be thinking what we're going to do in a wartime setting.
Yeah, and Gordon, you've warned about this for years in books like Plan Red on your X account and elsewhere. Look, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has declared a shooting war against the United States, but as you just laid out, a covert war on many fronts. More on that with top China expert Gordon Chang after the break. Don't move. Living in uncertain times with inflation, stock market volatility, and recession warnings, analysts are urging Americans to get prepared right now. That's why you should strongly consider gold and silver to help protect your retirement accounts like IRAs and 401ks. We're talking to our good friend Gordon Chang. Folks, be sure to follow him on X and across social media. Gordon, a lot of people are saying, look, this is a trade war with China's communist regime. President Trump is saying, hey, we're going to hold the line. Do you think essentially that the Chinese communist regime will eventually blink? Will this eventually de-escalate, or will things ramp up?
Well, they've started to de-escalate in Beijing because, as we reported at the end of last week, China is now not imposing tariffs on industrial chemicals, aviation products, and semiconductors from the U.S. And there's also reports that China won't impose tariffs on other products as well. They may not formally announce this, but they're nonetheless not imposing those costs. And that's an indication that China is starting to relent. And they actually have to, because remember, they use components from America in their finished products, which they then export. And China now has an export-dependent economy. So, yes, they're going to have to relent, and this is a good sign that they are folding, if we're going to use the term of the day.
Yeah, President Trump's philosophy of peace through strength actually works. Imagine that. And yet, Gordon, we have 12 states right now suing the Trump administration over tariffs. Why is that so problematic? Look, we need to be against this rising threat, which you've laid out. We need to be unified as a nation, yet we've got 12 states suing the president over tariffs. Seems like a big problem.
It is a big problem, but I don't think those suits are going to go anywhere because the President of the United States, but the Constitution gives to the President the right to conduct foreign affairs, and this is a foreign affair of great importance. We've got a common enemy. So I think this is grandstanding on the part of, for instance, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. Yeah. So I don't think these suits are actually going to proceed that far. This is more just sort of like trying to get votes in these individual states.
Yeah, Gavin Newsom is not beyond grandstanding, needless to say. Gordon, how stable is the communist regime in Beijing right now? How stable is Xi Jinping, his leadership? Is this a steadfast, united regime, or are there cracks in the armor in Beijing?
I think there are cracks. We're seeing signs of infighting. So, for instance, Xi Jinping's most senior loyalist in the Chinese military, as General He Weidong, has not been seen in public since March 11th. Now, most people say that Xi Jinping got rid of his number one guy, but there are objective factors which suggest that Xi Jinping's adversaries in the Chinese military got rid of Xi Jinping's loyalists. And if that's indeed the case, it means essentially all-out warfare at the top of the military, which is the most important part and faction of the Communist Party. We've also seen signs of infighting among civilians. And that is sort of to be expected because Xi Jinping is being blamed for some disastrous policies. With the closure of a lot of factories in the southern portion of the country, the export-oriented areas, there could very well be unrest. And so I think that this is a volatile situation in China.
Wow, very interesting. And speaking of volatile, I've called this alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea the Gathering Storm Coalition. What's the latest there, Gordon? How closely is China cleaving to Russia, Iran, and North Korea? Is that relationship deepening?
The relationships have deepened. When we see these in the wars that China is fighting 3 proxy wars, in effect, on 3 separate continents: Europe and Ukraine, in Asia, in the Middle East, and in the northern parts of Africa. China is fueling insurgencies that look like wars. We're seeing, for instance, in Ukraine, we're seeing Chinese military officers there, and there's a lot of Chinese equipment that is showing up on the battlefield. So when you look at China's across-the-board support for the Ukraine war effort, you have to say that China is a combatant.
Wow. What a point there. And final point, about a minute left, Gordon. Taiwan. When we talk about China and it's flexing its muscle and extending its hegemony, especially in Asia, we talk about Taiwan, of course. Any rumblings among the Chinese Communist Party about any potential moves, God forbid, against Taiwan? Or has that chatter kind of died down since President Trump came back into office?
Well, there's been chatter there because Xi Jinping has based his legitimacy on the annexation of Taiwan. I think because of the problems in the Chinese military, Xi Jinping is not going to start hostilities with an invasion of the main island of Taiwan. But we got to remember that in the last 3 weeks, we've seen very provocative Chinese military activity against South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and Australia. So Taiwan is not the only victim here.
Yeah, Gordon, great breakdown as always, my friend. Author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. You just laid it out, Gordon. What a wake-up call. Keep up the great work, my friend. And be sure to follow Gordon on X and across social media. God bless, Gordon. We'll see you again soon. And coming up after the break, Gordon just laid it out. Waking up to evil. We're starting to do it. It's not too late, but we've got a lot of work to do. My final thoughts on that after the break.